A single metal connected three continents, created the first truly global economy, and made some empires obscenely wealthy while destroying others from the inside out. But here's the twist. Nobody planned it. This wasn't some grand design by kings or philosophers. It was merchants chasing profit margins, one transaction at a time, accidentally wiring the world together. And the entire system hinged on one strange fact. China wanted silver more than anyone else on Earth. Why? Because they made a policy decision that would reshape global commerce for 3 centuries. In the next few minutes, you'll see how a tax code in Beijing determined what happened in the mines of Peru, how arbitrage became the engine of globalization, and why this 16th century money loop is the blueprint for every reserve currency crisis you'll ever witness. If you want to understand how invisible financial forces shape empires, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe, because we're about to reverse engineer the mechanics of the first global monetary system. Let's start with the foundation. Silver wasn't valuable because it was rare. It was valuable because it was useful as money. But money only works if everyone agrees it works. And in the 1500s, the world didn't agree on much. Europe used a chaotic mix of gold, silver, and copper coins. The Middle East preferred gold. Africa had its own systems. But China? China went all in on silver. And that decision changed everything. Here's what happened. In 1581, the Ming Dynasty implemented something called the Single Whip Reform. Sounds boring, right? It wasn't. This reform did one simple thing. It required tax payments in silver instead of goods or labor. Overnight, every farmer, merchant, and landlord in the most populous empire on Earth needed silver to pay their taxes. The demand was instant and massive. But China's domestic silver production was tiny compared to the need. They had a problem, a big one. Now, here's where it gets interesting. At the exact same moment China created this enormous demand, Spain discovered something in South America that would define the next 3 centuries. The mountain of Potosi. This wasn't just a mountain. It was a silver deposit so rich that the Spanish couldn't believe it was real. Within decades, Potosi became the largest city in the Americas, bigger than London or Paris. The silver flowing out of that single mountain would account for roughly half of the world's silver production for over a century. But Spain had a problem too. They had all this silver, but their domestic economy couldn't absorb it. They needed goods. China had goods. China needed silver. See where this is going? The Spanish started shipping silver across the Pacific to Manila, where Chinese merchants were waiting. The merchants handed over silk, porcelain, and tea. The Spanish took the goods back to the Americas and Europe. Everyone made money. The loop was born. Now, you might think this was a fair trade between equals. It wasn't. The genius was in the price difference. Silver was worth more in China than anywhere else because demand was so intense. This created an arbitrage opportunity. Buy silver in the Americas, sell it in China, pocket the spread. Merchants didn't need to understand macroeconomics. They just needed to understand that the same ounce of silver bought more in Beijing than in Mexico City. That spread was the engine. It pulled silver east like gravity. Let me give you the numbers, because they're staggering. Between 1500 and 1800, somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 tons of silver flowed out of the Americas. Roughly half went to Europe, the other half straight to Asia, mostly to China. This wasn't charity. This was merchants following incentives. Every shipment reinforced the loop. More silver in China meant more economic activity, which meant more demand for goods, which meant more demand for silver to buy those goods. It fed itself. But here's the part that should make you nervous. This loop created dependencies. Spain's empire ran on silver revenue. The Chinese economy ran on silver liquidity. The merchants in between ran on the price spread. If any part of this system broke, everyone felt it. And that's exactly what happened, multiple times. Let's talk about Japan for a second, because they were the wild card. In the early 1600s, Japan was pumping out silver almost as fast as the Spanish Americas. Japanese silver flooded into China through trade networks, adding even more liquidity to the system. But then the Tokugawa shogunate looked at this situation and realized they were sending their monetary base overseas. So they did what any rational government would do. They restricted silver exports. Almost overnight, one of the major supply routes dried up. The price of silver in China spiked. Merchants scrambled. The loop wobbled but didn't break, because Spanish supply could still fill the gap. But it was a warning. The system was fragile. Now let's flip to the human side, because this wasn't just about metal and policy. This was about people chasing spreads, and the consequences were brutal. The silver mines of Potosi and other sites in the Americas operated on forced labor. The Spanish used the Mita system, an adaptation of an Inca labor draft to compel indigenous workers into the mines. Conditions were horrific. Thousands died. But the silver kept flowing because the economic incentive was too strong to stop. The arbitrage opportunity justified the human cost in the eyes of the people running the system. That's the dark side of incentive-driven systems. They optimize for profit, not for people. Meanwhile, in China, the flood of silver had its own consequences. In the short term, it was great. More money meant more economic activity, more trade, more growth. Chinese merchants got rich. The government collected taxes in a stable currency. But here's the kicker. China became addicted. Their entire fiscal system now depended on silver liquidity. When the silver supply was strong, everything worked. But when it weakened, the system seized up like an engine without oil. And weaken it did. By the early 1600s, the Spanish Empire was overstretched. Wars in Europe drained resources. Piracy disrupted shipments. Production at some mines started to decline as the easy deposits were exhausted. Less silver left the Americas. Less silver reached China. And the Chinese economy, built on the assumption of endless silver inflows, started to crack. The mid-1600s were chaos. The Ming Dynasty collapsed in 1644, and while there were many reasons for the fall, the silver crunch was a major factor. When silver became scarce, tax revenues dropped. The government couldn't pay its soldiers. Rebellions erupted. The whole structure came apart. Some historians argue that the Ming Dynasty was, in part, a casualty of a global liquidity crisis. A policy decision made decades earlier, combined with supply shocks halfway around the world, helped bring down one of history's great empires. Now here's where the story loops back to today. Because the mechanics haven't changed. The technology's different, the metals are different, but the incentives are identical. Modern reserve currencies work on the same principle as the silver loop. The world needs dollars to trade, just like the world needed silver in the 1600s. The US supplies those dollars through trade deficits, just like Spain supplied silver through mining and shipping. And when the supply tightens, or when confidence wobbles, you get global liquidity crises. Different century, same structure. Let's dig into that connection, because it's not just a metaphor. In the silver loop, the value of silver was determined by Chinese demand. If China changed its tax policy, or if internal conditions shifted, the entire system adjusted. In the modern dollar system, the value of the dollar is determined by global demand for a stable reserve currency. If US policy shifts, or if confidence in dollar stability cracks, markets everywhere react. The dependency is the same. The fragility is the same. And just like the silver loop created winners and losers, the dollar system does too. Countries that run trade surpluses accumulate dollars. Countries that run deficits supply liquidity. Exporters optimize for dollar earnings. Importers depend on dollar credit. And when the US Federal Reserve changes interest rates, it's not just a domestic decision. It's a global event, because everyone holding dollars or dollar-denominated debt feels the impact. The Spanish kings learned this the hard way when they debased their coinage to pay for wars. The trust collapsed, and so did the value of their money. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Monetary standards are geopolitical weapons. The Ming Dynasty learned that when their silver dependency became a vulnerability. The Spanish learned it when their silver wealth created enemies and inflation. And modern economies are learning it every time a sanctions regime cuts off access to dollar clearing systems. Control the money, control the system. That's not conspiracy, that's mechanics. But let's return to the core question. Why did this loop form in the first place? It formed because of a mismatch between supply and demand, combined with a technology to move goods globally. China had demand but no local supply. The Americas had supply but needed goods. Merchants had ships and incentives. The loop closed itself once those three elements aligned. Nobody sat down and designed a global silver standard. It emerged from millions of individual decisions, each one optimizing for local advantage. This is the pattern you see repeated throughout history. Empires don't plan to become dependent on external resources. It just happens when short-term incentives point in that direction. The British Empire became dependent on Indian cotton and Chinese tea. The modern economy became dependent on Middle Eastern oil. The dependencies form naturally, driven by arbitrage and advantage. And once they're in place, they're incredibly hard to break, because every participant has adapted to the system. The silver loop eventually faded, not because people decided to end it, but because the conditions changed. New World silver production stabilized but no longer grew at the same explosive rate. China's economy adapted and diversified its monetary base. Alternative trade routes and goods emerged. The loop didn't collapse, it evolved into something else. But the lessons remained. Here's the lesson for you. When you see a global system that seems stable, look for the dependencies. Who needs what? Who supplies it? What happens if the flow stops? Those questions reveal the fragility beneath the surface. The silver loop looked stable for decades, until it wasn't. The same applies to every monetary system, every trade network, every empire built on resource flows. And here's the deeper lesson. Human incentives are consistent across time. Merchants in the 1600s chased arbitrage opportunities the same way traders today chase spreads in currency markets. Governments then debased coins to fund wars. Governments now inflate currencies to fund deficits. Empires then fought over trade routes. Nations now fight over supply chains. The tools change. The incentives don't. So when you hear about de-dollarization or digital currencies or shifts in global trade, remember the silver loop. Remember that monetary systems are built on trust and dependency. Remember that arbitrage creates connections, and connections create vulnerabilities. And remember that nobody plans the system. It emerges from millions of decisions, each one following incentives, each one building the structure that eventually defines the world. The first global money loop wasn't designed by emperors or economists. It was built by merchants chasing profit, miners seeking wages, and governments trying to fund their ambitions. The machinery of incentives did the rest. And that same machinery is running right now, building the systems that will define the next century. Different metals, different tech, same human nature. If you found this useful, subscribe, because we're going to keep pulling apart the systems behind the chaos, one mechanism at a time.